Welcome to Aquatics by Nature. I can't believe it's now been just over a year since I set up this experimental no water change, no dose reef tank. Those of you who followed this tank will probably know that progress with this tank has been really quite slow, mainly because I've been extremely cautious as it's something new and it's really just something that I'm playing around and sort of experimenting with. Anyway, finally the time has come to actually add some fish to this tank, and I've actually been looking for a little while for a pair of really nice clownfish because it's only quite a small, sort of 60-litre tank. Anyway, I stumbled across this absolutely gorgeous pair a couple of weeks ago. They're just the normal sort of Ocellaris common clownfish, but I'd not seen any really this perfect for a very, very long while. And also, these particular two are definitely paired off in the tank. It was really obvious, so I really couldn't resist them. And clownfish are one of those things that I've kind of always wanted, but literally over all the years I've really just never got round to trying to keep them, which I think is a real shame, because had I realised what absolute joy they are in the aquarium, it's one of those things that I would have done years and years ago. They're just so fantastically engaging that they were almost feeding out of my hand within a couple of days of actually getting them home. They're just such good fun and just so unbelievably cute. And they already sort of set up their own sort of little patch, as it were, sort of primarily on the left-hand side of the tank, and they generally sort of dart away from that and always return to that corner. But it's kind of fun to watch anyway. And whenever I turn the main pump off, they've already learned to come to the top for food, but pretty much always in that corner. And as I say, it only took them a couple of days to kind of realise this. They're pretty eager feeders anyway, which is really good, because actually feeding them with the actual full flow on would actually be really quite tricky. So being able to turn that off and just let them feed in the corner is quite handy in a way. And unlike my sort of freshwater tanks, I don't have the same sort of level of experience with reefs. So this tank here is really very much a sort of experimental tank, and it's, well, I won't say a steep learning curve, but it is definitely quite a learning curve. But I think already I've kind of learned that there are actually already many sort of parallels to be had between my freshwater tanks and actually this new little sort of reef tank. Not least that the kind of plant mass, or in this particular case coral mass, is actually critically important to how well the tank actually functions. And I think one of the kind of rookie mistakes, if you like, that I made with this tank was probably buying sort of very small cultured frags. I kind of handicapped myself a little bit at this point, and maybe handicapped isn't actually the right word, but I greatly slowed down the sort of progress of the tank and how quickly things would actually evolve. And it's really just like a planted tank, when you need plenty of fast growing plants initially to kind of set the balance and get things ticking along and to suck up all those excess nutrients and hopefully to keep algae at bay. Well, basically, rather unsurprisingly, it seems to be true of corals as well. So I think it's one of those things that I maybe should have learned a little bit earlier, but it's like with anything new really, you learn as you're going along. And certainly with insufficient coral mass, it's definitely proved to be incredibly difficult to add sufficient food to the tank to actually make the corals grow without causing lots of algal problems. Hence, anyone that sort of followed my little sort of series on this tank will have seen that I've been through lots of sort of fairly minor but sort of algal phases within this tank. So I think it is definitely sort of slowed my progress, but I'm a kind of patient aquarist, so it's all part of the learning curve, so I don't really worry too much about it. Another parallel that actually I'm discovering is that, again, reef tanks are very much like planted tanks. They seem to do much, much better with a sort of corresponding population of fish and other critters. Basically, if you can feed the fish, and then basically the waste products from the fish will actually feed the corals, or in a freshwater tank will actually feed the plants. But it's all basically the same kind of thing, and it is basically a sort of symbiotic relationship between the fish, the critters, and the corals. And I can remember reading this, but it's one of those things that takes a little while to sort of twig and actually realise is actually that similar with a reef tank to actually a freshwater tank. And I certainly know from my planted tanks that are very unpopulated with fish, tend to have extremely poor plant growth. This seems to be particularly true of older tanks, so I guess I should really have realised sooner, as I have quite a few rather old freshwater tanks running. But as with most things new, I tend to be sort of ultra cautious, and even though I've only had these two clownfish a couple of weeks, I'm sure the coral growth has already accelerated quite considerably. And whilst yes, there is still a certain amount of algae in the tank, it seems to be quite stable. It doesn't seem to be sort of suddenly accelerating or doing anything sort of not terribly pleasant, as it were. And all being well, I'm actually considering getting a couple of, or maybe a small blenny, to hopefully help graze this algae a little bit. I didn't want to go down the sort of traditional route of adding a crab or a hermit crab, mainly because I've got lots of little colonista snails in this tank, which I rather like and are actually quite good miniature grazers, and most of the sort of creatures with claws tend to eat the actual snails, so I wanted to avoid anything that might cause any problems like that. Anyway, I'm hoping now that the corals gradually increase in size, that the algae will actually be easier to control, and then at some point what I really want to be able to do is to get the proper opportunity to actually test my idea of solely being able to use soft corals for actual nutrient export, sort of over the medium or maybe even the long term, as it were. So if it kind of pans out with this tank, I think it could end up being really quite an exact parallel with how I run my freshwater tanks without water changes. Anyway, it's a really kind of fascinating experiment, and something, as I say, that is relatively new to me. And even though it's a little bit sort of painfully slow and it's a very long way off being perfect, it's one of those things that I'm kind of really enjoying and sort of learning a little bit on the fly. And I guess I could have gone faster if I'd have actually splashed out on some much bigger corals to actually start off with, but I didn't have the budget at the time, so it's absolutely fine to just take the slow route. And I know I got plenty of other little minor things wrong, as it were. You may remember, going back a little way, I increased the amount of flow in this tank, and that made quite a big difference to it. But I think probably the biggest mistake in many respects that I actually made was actually with the temperature. I started the tank off only in the sort of low 70s, and I now realise that reefs actually in nature actually live in really quite a narrow temperature range, and it's actually quite a bit higher than that. So I've now got the temperature up in the high 70s, which I know is actually still relatively low for a reef tank, so there's still actually scope to increase that a little bit, but I was a little bit wary of having it too high, basically to give it a little bit of a buffer so that when we get a heat wave it doesn't too easily actually lift up into a sort of dangerously higher level, rather than just being a little bit high, as it were. And certainly reefs seem to be in a much narrower temperature range than freshwater habitats anyway. They're generally much more stable. And I'm hoping eventually, as the corals grow, that the clowns might actually host in one of the corals. Maybe one of the big sort of toadstools would be kind of fun. The long tentacles are a little bit like an anemone, so it may be wishful thinking, but it's something I'm really hoping might happen in the long run. So although this tank has basically gone a year without any water changes or dosing, I think the jury is still very much out as to whether it's actually a long-term sort of solution or method of actually being able to run a reef tank. But hopefully the actual plan of being able to remove waste products with excess coral growth for nutrient export is actually one that may work. But I may ultimately have to sort of switch or change up a little bit, and I might have to use some macroalgae for nutrient export. Or who knows, I may have to do the odd water change. So it's one of those things that we'll just have to see, and really just see how it pans out. Ultimately, I love experimenting with different things, and I know from experience that you have to be quite flexible as things evolve and you learn new things. And as I say, sometimes you get things right, some things you don't get things right, but it's a great way of learning sort of on the fly. And touch wood, things don't tend to happen too quickly, sort of whether they're bad or wrong, really. They all have their own little sort of effects, and if you can monitor things closely, hopefully you can put yourself on the sort of right path. But I must admit, I'm already a little bit addicted to this, and I'm slightly contemplating already using one of the new sort of 40-gallon tanks as maybe an upgrade for a reef. It's certainly tempting, but I don't know if I'll do it yet. So anyway, if you'd like to know more about how I maintain my tank so naturally without water changes or additives, I'd be eternally grateful if you subscribe and give me a like. You can also check out my playlists, but most importantly, enjoy your aquarium. Don't be a slave to it. Thanks for watching.